What's going on, folks? Welcome back to another episode of Nationalism on the road to the origins of the First World War. Professor Way here, John the historian. We're going to get right up to it. We're going to finish up the Italian Unification. We're probably going to roll over a little bit from the next one into the next one, right into the German Unification, okay? Now, last time we left off is basically the Third Italian War of Independence. Now, there is a fourth. Alright, that doesn't take place until later on during the First World War. Because you got to remember the Roman question. Alright, there's a lot of questions in history. There's a Roman question, the Polish question, the Eastern question, the Jewish question, the peasant question. There's a lot of these questions in history where they actually said the question about something, right? If you're going to question something, it means we need an answer. What's the answer on this? Where's this going, right? It's like, why are you going to the party this weekend? It's a question. Well, I don't know how I'm going to get there, but you don't have a solid plan yet. Right? So, the Roman question. Okay? Now, the Roman question was basically the dispute between the church and the Italian state over the Roman papacy, especially right at the tail end of the Italian Unification, okay? Now, with the completion of the Italian Unification, it really wasn't totally 100% complete in 1870. Most of Italy was unified under one sole state. Keep this in mind. Very much so. Now, the Roman papacy rejected the new form of Italian state, remember, which was King Victor Emmanuel II. He becomes the monarch of the Kingdom of Italy. All this, the papacy and the Pope rejects that Rome and the surrounding areas, as much as Vatican City and the rest of the papal states, actually become part of the Italian unified kingdom. That was their own personal domain by the papacy, and the Pope, which was Pope Pius IX. At this point, rejected that after 1870. This is the Roman question. Now, this confrontation actually doesn't finally get resolved until 1929, 70 years after the fact, right? Way after World War I, right in the year the start of the Great Depression, 1929, in Italy, this question is finally resolved, and the papacy and Rome officially becomes part, and the rest of the papacy states, besides Vatican City. They reached an agreement between the papacy and the Italian state. And that's why today, Vatican City is classified as its own sovereign, independent nation to fly under its own flag, coat of arms, its own rules, its laws, and everything. Within and totally surrounded by the Italian state. This is where this comes from. And it's not that entirely, the Roman question was not entirely solved until 1929. The conflict was finally ended with a treaty. The Lateran Treaty, which it was called at that time. So, despite all of that, and every bit of it, that was actually resolved. And that's why we have what it is today. The Vatican City was created. The Pope's home. It's its own small kingdom, one of the smallest countries in the world. Is it the smallest country in the world? Trivia fact for you. Alright? Now, you gotta remember before this happened, you had a good Baldy has another famous march on Rome. Throughout the course of human history and Roman history, of the city of Rome, there's been lots of marches on Rome. Pretty much about 2,000 men, volunteers, things like that, marched into the city with banners, death or Rome. So, basically pretty clear. We're going to die, or Rome's going to be a part of the unified Italian state. Very demanding. All right? Very, very demanding. But the Italian state doesn't really become really unified completely in what we know it as today until 1929. Even after World War I, with the treaty was signed and the Treaty of Versailles, they gained two territories that had great Italian populations along their border in the north, right? Especially after 1866 with the Prussian-Austrian War, remember. Because of that came out of that, they got those territories because Prussia won and they were allied with Prussia. Italy, the Italians. All right? So, well, at that point, it was the Kingdom of Sardinia. So, it's pretty much the spearhead and the main kingdom of all the Italian kingdoms that was pushing towards unification at this point. Now, then in 1865, basically, Florence became the capital of the Kingdom of Italy. But they always desired Rome because of that historical lineage of Rome, right? So, in that heritage, Rome has to be the capital of the Italian people. Now, Rome was the heart, the beating heart. One of the oldest cities in the world and one of the oldest cities in Europe and one of the world's first cities to reach over 1 million people back during the Roman Empire. So you got to think Rome had a lot of significant historical, cultural. This is where everything originated for the Italian people, right? And throughout to the collapse of the Roman Empire, the entire geographical region of the Italian boot, people started to classify themselves, we're all one kind of people, remember, even after the collapse. Not the official collapse of the Roman Empire, but the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. So you got to think about that, just hundreds of years, right? Even before that, and even after that, right? Just got to remember, Rome was founded in 453 BC. Traditional date. Is it 100% concrete? But that's pretty much most historians and most people agree on is that's the date of the founding of Rome. The city of Rome. All right, that's when Rome started pretty much from 753 to 509 is pretty much the Age of Kings. Which is funny because after unification they come to a kingdom of Italy. And then they're going to have a little sponsor of a dictatorship like they would do in the Roman Empire. Then it became a modern nation. But it's funny how that mimics and mirrors itself a little bit in its own geographical location of that region of how these people do it for the Italians. But hey, it all works. It all works, right? Now, you got to remember the agreements when the Third War of Italian Unification took place, 1866, right? So, allied, Prussia and Sardinia were in Italy was allied against the Austrians. Okay, this was the 7 Weeks' War. It's also known as, or the Austrian-Prussian War. We'll be getting more into that on the other flip side of the coin, on the German aspect, during the German unification. Very important for them. But it was also important for Italian unification. This is where these are linked. And kind of jerk each other back and forth, right? This is pretty cool how the effects of actions of somewhere else affects you, right? And vice versa. So, when that war ended in a Prussian victory, Prussia guaranteed during that treaty, after the 7 Weeks' War, during that entire time, that, bingo, right? You're getting those territories from the Austrians. We're going to put that in the treaty, and the Prussians kept their word. Yeah. So, for Austria, it was a hit. They lost territory, they lost 2 cities, they lost 2 regions in northern Italy. Their influence was kaput by this point. All right? And the Austrians themselves were pretty much fighting a war on 2 fronts against the Prussians and the Italians that were coming up on their western flank. So it was kind of, and they got slaughtered on the battlefield, okay? Slaughtered, especially at the Battle of Cusco. Okay, it got slaughtered there. But anyway, that's when the Italians came in and things like that. But during the war, though, with the Austrians, because you got to remember, a lot of people just focus on the Prussians, the Austrians going to war, and the Austrian-Prussian War of 1866 or the 7 Weeks War. A lot of people, even in school, high school, everything, people forget that the Austrians are actually fighting somewhere else at this time too, against the Italians. Two-front war. This is something you don't learn in school, and no teacher actually promotes this. Okay, now it was a major battle. Okay, this is the end. This is the final piece of the Third War of Italian Unification. Okay, now there's a lot of or pretty much land and even naval engagements during this time against the Austrians, and the Italians were new at this. But now on June the 24th, 1866, was one of the most significant Austrian victories. Okay, where the Italian forces were at totally superiority, totally outnumbered. Okay, and they were defeated by the Austrian general at the time was Archduke Ajdek, or forcing a retreat at this time. After it was the Battle of Cusco. All right, June the 24th, 1866. Very important date, but there's a lot of other massive. That was an Austrian victory. The Austrians had a little confidence, especially when they're losing against the Prussians on the other side. So now the invasion, pretty much the next month in July 1866, the Austrians actually launched an invasion. But this is where General Garibaldi, he's known in his volunteers, they started to push into Austrian territory. And they won a massive victory. Okay, this was called the invasion of Trentino. And basically what happened was, and they had the Battle of, part of my Italian on this one, is Beschetta, okay? Now that took place in July the 21st, 1866. These are the major battles that go into this confrontation, right? This landed in a massive Italian victory. The Austrians were smashed at this point. They didn't even know what to do. They only had volunteer forces, the Italians. It wasn't a professional army. Not much of a professional army. They did have a professional army that came from Sardinia region, remember, but not compared to the Austrians. The entire 100% of the Austrians had a professional army and well equipped and supplied, and they still lost against it. That nationalistic spirit held in the Italians, because they're like, this is our nation, our home, we created this, we're fighting for this. All right, the world's against us, it would seem. They're gonna kick some ass, okay? And that's the Italians. They went in there and they smashed this. There was a massive victory on July the 21st, 1866. And on the battlefield, all right? They showed that right out the get-go. They showed it all the way. It was a massive, massive victory on so many levels, okay? Now, about a week later, June the 26th, another battle actually takes place. This was actually the final Italian victory. And they defeated the Austrian troops. They crossed on the river, okay, marking the furthest advance into Austrian territory by the Italians. And the Austrians didn't know what to do. The Italians are in our empire. What are we doing here? What are we doing? What are we doing, boys? We're losing is what we're doing. And that's exactly what the Austrians were doing. Because the Italians had the ball rolling. They had that nationalistic spirit, mottos of Italy for Italy, right? We're going to get Italy free from foreign domination. We're going to show the world that we can defeat the Austrians, that we are standing strong as a unified kingdom of Italy, okay? So they didn't want to put a whole lot of pressure on this point, okay? So basically, in 1867, the year after the fact, the Kingdom of Italy actually seceded because Austria was defeated by this time between the Austrian-Prussian War. Okay, so they gained Venice and Veneto, okay, in northern Italy. Those two provinces become part of the Italian kingdom. This was huge by any stretch of the imagination. This shocked the world. The Austrians lost. They went on a two-front war. They couldn't do it. It was impossible to do. All right. So now, it's going to take a couple of years. They're working out everything with the Italian kingdom. You got to remember that. Now, what breaks out in 1870? The Franco-Prussian War. Now, this affects Italy once again. Remember, they're allied with Prussia. Okay? Now, why would this be significant? Because you got to remember, Gallipoli marched on Rome again, right after. Okay, during pretty much the tail end of the Third Italian War of Independence. But this time, he didn't have 2,000, he had 7,000 volunteers, which usually ended up, which wasn't really successful because he did get imprisoned. He only gets out in a bit, but not yet. He does get imprisoned and captured again. They let him out. At this time, you had the Franco-Prussian War. Now, as you'll remember from the other episodes, France had a lot of soldiers and garrisons in Rome. Well, all those boys, because France was at war with Prussia, well, Germany, we could say by this point, all those troops needed to go back to the homeland to fight against the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War, okay? So it left the entire region and the papacy defenseless, and there was not much French soldiers left. I mean, a couple toddlers could go in, a couple throw rocks at them and knock them out, and there would be a victory. There was not many left. Most of them all went to fight against the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War to defend France. Now, what happened there affects Italy. Knights more, okay? Because by this time, there's an offer put to Pope Pius. He rejects the offer. Now, after that, there's a third march on Rome, and finally, Rome is finally captured, and then things are starting to, okay, we can try, we're still not going to do this, but we'll see what happens after that, right? But eventually, it's all done and dealt with by about 1929, okay? By 1929. 110% all done by then. Now, as you remember, in 1866 is also the Third Italian War of Independence. It was a pivotal conflict between the Kingdom of Italy and the Austrian Empire. Always keep that in mind. But at the same time, Austria is going to war with the Prussians. All right, because it's also the the Austro-Prussian War. But this is also the Austrian-Italian War. All right, but in Italy, it's also known as the Third War of Italian Unification. Not Russia. Russia's doing their own thing at this point. They're still licking their wounds a little bit and pretty much almost healed up by this point, close to, after the Crimean War in 53 to 56. So, now this was a military struggle. And it was not just, Italy, the Kingdom of Italy had a massive strategic alliance with Prussia because they realized, Prussia's got beef. We'll ally themselves with that. Strategic, isn't it? Great diplomacy because Prussia would be like, okay, this is going to help us out a lot. Did Prussia really need the Italians as allies during this time? Not really, but it really put a lot of pressure on the Austrians because they had to fight a two-front war, which originally they were just hoping to take on the Prussians. But the Prussians were more technological and militarily advanced and even disciplined more than the Austrian troops. But, okay, one unification, like the German unification and the Italian unification, are intertwined. They both help build each other towards a unified nation. And this is the greatest thing about it. I love this part of history because it's like, wow, every action has a reaction. This is a prime example. What happens here affects over there. But you don't think. But it does. And in this case, both unifications play off each other to form the Italian Kingdom of Italy and the German Reich, or the German Empire. All right, after 1871. So it's fairly, very secure. Now, during this war, the Italians, as we could just recall, there was a naval warfare, but the Italians just lost that one. I don't want to get into that, but I would love to, because there's not too many naval wars between the Austrians and the Italians, but it is pretty significant. An interesting war alone. But Garibaldi, at this time, he took a regular army and struggled with it. He took a bunch of volunteers, and he went and invaded Austrian territory. You got to think about this. And this is where national comes in, because the Italians are really getting more and more nationalistic. And they're proud of their nation that they just built and established. It's not fragmented. It ain't divided. Little bit of thing we're going to have to deal with the papacy and the Pope. But overall, great. You know? So they finally unified their country. But I wouldn't really honestly say it's finally unified until 1929. Okay, but it is the the Italian unification period where the majority, like 95%, is unified. All right, get a little bit more after the Treaty of Versailles, and then after that, time of the Great Depression in 1929, they finally get Rome to themselves without any papacy, and all the papal lands are 100% Italian, owned by the Italian state and people, and then Vatican City. I don't know why I keep saying Venice City. I'm sorry if I did. But Vatican City becomes its own independent nation within the Italian territory. So everything works out, all right? If Italy wanted to invade the papacy, which would have never happened, because, as you know, the Catholic Church in Italy is like this. They're in one flesh. They are married to each other. Right? And probably in the foreseeable future, a long time yet to come. Okay, maybe before the apocalypse. Probably right up to the apocalypse. All right, right up to the end of days. So I'm going to rule that one out right off the get go. All right, I will rule that one out off the get go. So it's pretty good that way. But anyways, besides all that jazz and junk, but as it is. But with that alliance, it really helped a lot. My cats are crazy. But anyway. So, it really helped. This was the German unification. Now, nationalism played a very significant role in a lot of this as you go through the steps. And this sets the stage up for later. Remember the relationship between the Italians and the Austrian Empire as much as the Italians and the French. Because there's still a little bit of territories that a lot of Italians still live under foreign rule. Okay, especially with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Remember, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire formed in 1867. Same year that Canada gets its independence. A lot happens in the world that year. Also in 1867, what else happens? The purchase of Alaska happens where America actually purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire, all right, to cover the funds lost and the economic loss from the Crimean War. Remember, the Crimean War ended in 1856, and they decided to sell it in 1867. Okay, so you got to think about all that. But next time we're actually going to talk about is pretty much the German unification. And there's going to be a lot into the German unification. We're going to look at before 1848, pretty much, what Germany was like. Germany was made up of about 39, divided into 39 German states, and everything like that. How Napoleon created the Confederation, the German Confederation, and things like that. We'll be getting more into that later on, but in the next episode. So yeah, we'll get right into the German unification. We'll talk a little bit. Gonna rerun a little things of the thing. Talk a little doofy there, guys. But anyway, we'll get into the German unification and go from there on those things. So until next time, we're going to be talking about German unification, how the role of nationalism plays within German unification, and how it contributes to the origins of the First World War. And why is nationalism a very important figure? After we wrap all this up, we're going to take all these examples and put them together into modern day time. Why is nationalism a very important world shaper? It shaped the world, not just the political boundaries or the geopolitics of the physical landscape that we see on a map, that we have invisible borders, but and things like that. Why is it such a powerful movement and an ideology that inspires not just a couple of people or 100 or 1,000, but millions of people to join? And why is it such an importance? If you did watch the Tower of Babel, there's a lot of nationalism in that theology and history series, which I have another one coming out in March. So we're gonna be it's gonna be a little different. We might not be the Book of Genesis. I might switch it a little bit. We're gonna do another important event in history. So one of my favorite empires I like to study in the ancient world. So, and their involvement within the biblical contents. So, and go from there in the biblical story. So, but we'll get to that. Until next time, remember, history is who you are today. So whatever you make for history today will change your future. Keep that in mind.